So my name is Bolong. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Solar AI Technologies. We're a rooftop solar startup based in Singapore, fundamentally providing a zero upfront cost rent-to-own model for residential and small commercial properties.
What was the initial spark or insight that kind of made you decide that this was a particular area or venture worth pursuing?
Climate change has been something which I've been quite focused on or maybe quite worried about in the last 5 years or so. Personally had kind of a couple occasions of feeling like what climate anxiety and climate anxiety attack really felt like. And rooftop solar, I think ultimately was something that attracted me a lot, primarily because rooftop solar is one of those technologies within the climate space where the technology is already, fundamentally better than traditional or alternative, in this case, sources of energy. Right. And what's really needed is really just to go and drive deployment, drive adoption of the technology. One of the problem statements that we started off early on was we realized that in the region, while US and Europe were a lot more mature, there was still a very big problem of kind of like a lack of trust and awareness. Over time, as we've built up the startup, we've also kind of like pivoted along ways of trying to tackle and solve the problem. Right? We first started building up the company extremely data science focused to try and streamline and allow a solar company to very easily identify which are the most suitable rooftops within a region, right? Built a lot of computer vision models, pulled in a lot of real estate data to try and figure out, okay, which are the biggest rooftops for the most solar panels, able to generate the most energy, but then also fundamentally properties which are already using a lot of energy, right? Maybe have like longer lease terms so they're able to stretch out and maximize the value of solar. But over time started to realize that trust, that lack of trust, that lack of awareness on the customer side was preventing customers from moving ahead, right? We started to then move into like a digital brokerage model, really to try and eliminate any barriers to entry for customers to get solar, right? Okay, if nobody trusts that like the product, let's try and drive a lot of education and awareness. We started writing a lot of content. Let's then start to help customers easily get different quotes in their hands that they're able to go and compare against. Let's then also kind of like guide customers through, right, on what kind of systems are the best for them, finally till that point where then they just like move ahead with rooftop solar. Then when about 12 months ago, we started piloting and launching the zero upfront cost rent-to-own models in Singapore. We're still the first and only in Singapore to be able to do so down to the residential segment. The value proposition to customers is pretty simple. So instead of paying upfront for solar, we install, we maintain, we service their solar systems over a 5 or 10 year period, and then simply just charge them like a flat monthly fee, right? Think of it almost as a lease. But in that, across that entire period, we give them like a performance guarantee. If there's any issues with the system, all out-of-pocket costs are covered by us. And ultimately, what this provides to a customer is like a completely risk-free way of just getting a rooftop solar system on their roof, because the monthly fees that they're paying us is already lower than their bill savings, right? So now instead for them, it's why not, right? Because on that first month, once the solar system's turned on, whatever they're paying us, they're already saving more than that, right? So there's a really like a net monthly savings instead of like a break-even period of what they would deem as like 6 to 7 years. Otherwise, if they pay for the system upfront, now the break-even is basically on the first month.
What is the scope of the opportunity within a place like Southeast Asia? Why is that a good market to be starting up, looking at sort of solar energy and rooftop solar in particular?
If you kind of think about rooftop solar penetration from like the number of rooftops which are available in the region, at this point, Southeast Asia as a region is still under 1%, right? So there's a lot of rooftops which are still yet to be solarized, but yet the technology is already mature and it's already like a cheaper source of electricity for customers. Within the energy industry, there is a term called the levelized cost of electricity, or like LCOE, right, which essentially measures kind of the end-to-end value chain of every different energy source, right, through to that end distribution or use of every kilowatt hours of electricity. This is consistently for rooftop solar lowest across all different countries, even when we have several countries which are significantly subsidized in terms of their energy bills. But of course, we start to observe that like these kinds of energy subsidies in the region is not something that's long-term sustainable. There's a lot of fossil fuel assets being heavily subsidized, but you start to see trends in Malaysia and Indonesia of governments starting to think about or implementing policies to take out these subsidies. Even though there's these opportunities, it has its fair share of challenges in terms of kind of this lack of trust awareness outside of Singapore, especially that financing ability of a rooftop solar system becomes much more of a pain point as well, which really prevents accessibility to rooftop solar ownership. Let's try and then bring accessibility to all of these kinds of new, more innovative kind of financing models into the region to try and drive ownership.
And then if you were to put a number on it, what would you say kind of like the total addressable market opportunity would be for rooftop solar in Southeast Asia, market by market or as a whole?
So I mean, like just within kind of big six market, and because we started out as a data science company, we actually did quite a bit of studies on this, playing with kind of geospatial data to do estimates, right? But just within the big six markets, and primarily as a company, we are also focusing on a subset of the market, which is generally in rooftop solar industry terms, like below 500 kilowatt peak capacity. But typically, these are really like rooftop solar systems which are below about 300,000 US dollars in terms of like capital expenditure, right? Typically in the market, like say, for example, in Singapore or in the region, while we're one of the first to be able to launch these rent-to-own models to the residential segment, zero upfront cost solar models do exist. Right, they exist in a form which is called power purchase agreements, generally though just for really large scale properties. So a lot of the multinationals like Engie, Total, quite a few of the large local players, typically these are like either oil and gas companies or potentially like really large industrial or construction companies who then moved into solar, right? Will run power purchase agreements for all of these really large scale assets. But as long as kind of your rooftop solar system is maybe like below 300,000 in terms of capital expenditure, like these SME customers as well, they don't get access to these kinds of offer, right? So when we're looking at market size for us as a company, we don't want to kind of move into that extremely large scale space to compete with all the existing developers. That is already like a solved problem. But within the rest of the SME, as well as down to the residential space, even when we're looking at just the addressable rooftops, meaning like taking out the set of rooftops which we know to be, not feasible for solar installation, within the big six that we're looking at in Southeast Asia, there's about $250 billion of investment opportunities there from a capital expenditure perspective.
What are you most excited about? What do you see the changes that are going to happen to date and then over the next sort of 5 to 10 years that perhaps are in favor of kind of a proposition like solar AI?
When we're looking forward at kind of how technology will improve, you can kind of extrapolate that same trend, right? Of course, generally at this point in time, like monosilicon technology will no longer be as it's going into kind of like the more plateau portions of the curve, right? In terms of like that technological curve. Most rooftop solar panels these days, the best in class in the market, you'd see efficiency ratings of about like, this is a technical term, but technical efficiency rating of about like 23%. A lot of kind of studies have also then kind of put the technological limit for these existing technologies at about like 32%. So you'll see, while maybe 10 years ago, all of the solar panels were maybe being built at like 8%, right? We have kind of like nearly tripled that over the last 10 years, but we wouldn't be continuing to go and triple it. There are other new types of kind of like base technologies which are being explored, but like perovskites, for example, but those are still a little bit at kind of like that R&D phase, right? I think what's kind of pretty interesting is also maybe like two other things. One is you start to see a lot more focus in terms of like the deployment of building integrated photovoltaics or like building applied photovoltaics. So of course, I mean, especially in Hong Kong and Singapore, right? Like we have a lot of tall buildings, apartments. Most of us will live in, like an apartment where we don't have roof space. And in such cases, then does that mean that we are limited to not having any access to solar? At this point, maybe yes, right? But in a couple of years, when like the technology in terms of kind of efficiency, in terms of sunlight capture for like building applied or building integrated photovoltaics has improved, then now you can start to look at, like solarizing the facades of all of these like tall buildings, apartments as well. Of course, in markets where energy is maybe a bit more kind of like volatile, right? So, but then you start to see a lot of kind of decentralized rooftop solar assets and their battery storage systems starting to become actually like a very big way to go and solve grid instability problems by allowing these batteries to discharge at the right times, allowing customers or end users to go and profit at higher discharge rates, right, where the grid needs that kind of electricity the most, but then also from a national perspective kind of balances out grid instability.
What would you say that people are missing when they think that this is just a tried and true method that is just being copied into a different market with potentially similar economics as what you see in those other more established markets?
Yep, no, it's a very good question. I mean, probably one of the earliest, and like most people would know this, but one of the earliest models in which this was applied was really like Solar City, right? Maybe 15 years ago, then founded by Elon Musk's cousins, eventually then acquired by Tesla. At the point in time, Solar City was also able to do it because they heavily utilize tax incentives from the US government, right? And you see this being kind of a similar model in a lot of more mature markets in US and Europe, right? Started out at a point in time when the cost of solar wasn't yet kind of, the cheapest source of energy, and it needed or needing like government incentives to try and like drive adoption forward. Now, I think one of our observations was also ultimately most of these companies are already operating in sizable markets or regions and have yet to like even think about moving into Asia or even Southeast Asia specifically. So there's still like a very wide space in Southeast Asia where no one is trying to solve. But down to the specific business model and how we operate, ultimately, as a company that's kind of born out of the region. In my past life, I was also working as a venture builder to do market expansion specifically for tech startups, Carousel, with Homage as an example. So both kind of within the broadly speaking kind of, software space. And I realized that even between, say, Singapore and Malaysia, even say between like Singapore to Hong Kong, there are sufficient like nuances, right, that you actually would need to localize significantly to. And it's not just saying like, oh, yeah, Singapore and Hong Kong, it's pretty much the same consumer behavior with the same density of cities is very similar. And so, whatever that Carousel has built out in Singapore would just be directly applicable when we're doing a launch in Hong Kong. Same for Singapore and Malaysia. A lot of people would tend to see that, okay, there's a lot of cultural similarities. But then when we started operating kind of in Malaysia and like trying to utilize the same playbook, we realized that there's a lot of things that we need to do, right? Because say a lot of people in Malaysia would use emails less frequently, right? A lot of kind of communications is just centered around using WhatsApp or calls. And so some of the automations that we built on our software, like the utilization rate was extremely low. The way that we acquire customers in Singapore and over time, as we start to look at building it for the region, we've also started to kind of build digital site survey process through WhatsApp, right? Trying to streamline and automate things as much as possible. But of course, all of these are like really micro steps along the way, but ultimately then kind of shaping the entire customer experience of how they get solar, right? When we're working on solving a problem statement about a product where there's already fundamentally like a lack of trust and awareness, it is important for us to try and make the rest of the customer experience as streamlined, as enjoyable as possible, as familiar, as comfortable as possible, so that we then also allow them to kind of open themselves up to the idea of like getting solar on their roof.
Of course. And then finally, if you were to give advice to, say, someone in high school right now, what would you advise them to start spending their time?
In general, it's really just like just get started working or building on something. I think when I was in college as well, I always had dreams of, becoming an entrepreneur in the longer term. But I've always kind of, I think, overanalyzed on like what is the right thing, what is the right problem statement to solve, what is the right approach, to go and solve that. And ultimately then it was a lot of kind of like thinking and not enough doing, right? Which fundamentally as an entrepreneur, it's important for you to be extremely action biased and to try and test out different approaches of working on or trying to solve a problem.
And if people who want to find out more about solar AI, support what you're doing, or just learn a little bit more, about, the prospect of solar rooftop energy, where can they find out more information?
Yeah, so site's probably the best place, www.getsolar.ai. We have, as a company, also started out and still continue to do so, write a lot of content about rooftop solar to try and drive awareness, to try and build a community around it. So yeah, that then, sits on our website as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Bolong.
Awesome. Thanks for your time, Gordon.